begin, just to get a sense of the audience, I want to find out who among you is actually going to be transitioning this year. I'm going to show a polling question for you guys to answer, and I'm going to open it up for just a quick minute just to get your response. So how many of you are going to be implementing the new framework in 2014? And when I mean 2014, I mean the calendar year, December 31st. How many of you are actually going to transition this year? So we have a fairly large group this time around, so I'm hoping that you guys will answer the question fairly quickly. I do not like to keep these polling questions open for very long. We're going to close it out in another just 15 more seconds. Again, are you transitioning this year? This will help guide me as I present some of the transition materials for the rest of this webinar, especially some of the Q&A items I know I'm going to be dealing with. So we're going to close out the polling question, and I'm going to share the results. So 60% of you are transitioning now, with the remaining of you not transitioning, which is 16% or so. There's close to 100 of you that actually are on with me live, which is wonderful. I'm glad that you're here. Now, who am I and what are we doing today? My name is Sonia Luna. I'm the owner and founder of Aviva Spectrum. I've been doing internal auditing now, just general auditing, for a little over 16 years. And a bunch of colleagues had asked me to start up a group, so it's not just myself but other colleagues, and it's called the COSO Implementation Group. And with that, we wanted to create a sense of a community, and you are a part of that community, and we thank you for being here with us. And part of the goal and objective was to create some technical content for our community members, which is you. So now that we've got a sense of what you all are doing, which 60% of you are going to transition this year, let's talk very briefly about what your peer group is doing. You're not alone, basically. The 60% that said that they're transitioning this year, there was a study done in very, very early 2013 by Protiviti. It was a Sarbanes-Oxley study, and the study was asking participants, if the framework was finalized in the first quarter of 2013, would you do it timely in 2014, or would you implement it based on the size of your filing status? And you'll see here what that meant is large accelerated filers were going to implement it first, and then others would implement it later in 2015, meaning the smaller non-accelerated filers. So the vast majority, as you can tell, 53% were going to do it this year. And then of those that were very large, almost 60% said that they were going to implement it based on their size, which basically means that they were going to try to do it in 2014. Now, I wanted to share with you, before we get knee-deep in some technical areas, please go to our website. We have this template here that we're going to be covering in a lot of detail. We're going to cover how to review these points of focus, how to analyze some of the data we're doing, but I want you to go to avivaspectrum.com and go to our blog, and you'll be able to download our templates from there. So write that down, or if you've got multiple web browsers going on right now, you can download it as we're going through this. So what's the agenda for today's webinar? We're going to cover very briefly just the core issues around some of the COSO principles in the updated framework. We're going to discuss the points of focus. COSO decided that instead of calling the attributes, the name attributes, they're now calling points of focus as the core characteristics of principles. We'll talk about attributes and testing and some of the new standards and how to deal with effectiveness in terms of trying to audit internal control items for attributes. And then we're going to come up with the templates that we've created and also your game plan for tomorrow. What we want you to walk away with after this webinar is creating your own transition plan, whether or not you decide to use our templates. I want you to leverage some key best practices. You'll find in the group, based on just our professional experience, there's a lot of people that will participate. And then there's going to be other templates besides ours that will give you guidance on transition, and therefore we'll point those out as we go through this technical webinar. But this is the agenda for today for the transition template webinar. Okay, now we're moving on to the group. So we were asked to participate, myself, again your host Sonia Luna, along with my peers, to create a community that would focus in on the issues and the challenges and the opportunities of dealing with this new COSO framework. Eventually, this group will become very industry focused. Right now, we're painting kind of a broader technical brush on what is it going to take to actually transition to the new framework. So I would encourage you to go to LinkedIn, because that's where the group is at. The vast majority of you I know have a profile on LinkedIn. Going forward, we are very much going to limit the number of these technical webinar participants to COSO implementation group members. The logo looks like this cube, so when you do search for it, you know you found it when you see this colored cube. And again, we're trying to focus on members-only benefits for the community, which we wanted to create, which is a very technical community. Now, what is the new framework? The framework visually has not changed. So it's the same cube that we were used to in 1992 when the original framework came out. It still has your 5 components, okay? The control environment, the risk assessment, control activities, information communication, and your monitoring activities. The difference is back in 1992, we had more than 17 principles. We had something like 32, but now they carved it down to and honed it into 17 principles. For those of you who are non-accelerated filers, and if you remember, COSO put out some updated framework items for you. They had 20 principles for the smaller reporting company. Now, it's not that they got rid of 3 principles from the smaller reporting company framework. They just simply merged 3 to get to 17. Now, the points of focus, there's over 80. There's, to be more specific, there's 86 points of focus. In the prior guidance, they call them attributes. So the prior framework, so what's the difference between points of focus and attributes? There were over 1,000 comments provided when COSO decided that they were going to refresh its framework. And one of the items that they discovered was that people didn't want a checklist approach. They wanted an approach that they would feel it was more of a characteristic evaluation and not a checklist, like you must have all these things. Long story short, the points of focus are just key characteristics to prove you have the core principles met. So throughout the guidance materials, you're going to see points of focus constantly stated, and also on the transition template, you'll see that as well. Okay, we're moving on to the next item. So what do those 17 principles look like? Visually, you can see that the control environment has the vast majority of the principles of the 17. There's 5. The risk assessment has 4 of its own, and then there's a tie for the control activities and the information and communication. They have 3 each. Now, in 2008, there was a technical set of guidance materials that COSO put out, and that was dealing with the monitoring aspects of COSO's framework. So in 2008, COSO put a project called monitoring guidance. And I invite you to go to CPA2biz.com to find out more about the monitoring guidance materials, because it hones in to the updated framework, and it offers in volume 3 some templates of its own on how to deal with best practices for monitoring activities. And this is a great value for those of you who are thinking of moving away from just the general COSO framework into the enterprise risk management framework. So I listed it here for you to remember, CPA2biz.com. That website is not only where you can get that 2008 COSO monitoring guidance, but it's also the site where you will have to purchase, I believe the cost is $176 for the COSO materials for the new framework as well. It's the same website. So unfortunately, it's not a free download for those volumes. Now, let's take a look at just the work for the transition. And I laid this out, and I've done this several times for different training groups and even just internal training. The control environment has the vast majority of the principles. There's 5. And remember earlier I called out the points of focus, which are key characteristics that you're trying to identify with each principle. So if I had to delegate the work of the transition, how would I delegate work, right? So what we did is we summarized the points of focus in our template, which we're going to share in just a moment, but we're showing you where a lot of the work is going to be focused in on based on COSO's own quantifiable analysis. So you can see right away, for example, that Principle 5 has 6 points of focus, right? So if I'm delegating this entire component, the control environment, I already know there's a lot more work just in this one principle versus any other principle that I'm dealing with from 1 to 4, right? So moving on to points of focus and the identification between a principle and a point of focus, I want to share with you approaches. So the way COSO laid out in its volume 2, 3, and 4, they said, okay, we're not going to call things attributes because it's too much of a checklist, but we're going to call them points of focus, which are key characteristics, and then we're going to offer up the marketplace core approaches that might be used to ensure that you've met the characteristics of each point of focus. So what does that mean exactly? It means that some approaches will be better than others in terms of the points of focus. So for example, if I had established standards of conduct as an approach, it probably will align to both point of focus 1 and 2. But leading by example on matters of integrity and ethics probably only leads into point of focus 2. Now, C, evaluating management and other personnel, including outside service providers, aligns to the 3rd point of focus. And the approach D deals with the point of focus number 4. Now, COSO has already said that you do not need to meet 100% of each point of focus, yet it does warn you that if you don't have each of the point of focus items done, if you can't align and you can't say that you're actually doing these, you can't identify these characteristics, you should state why, okay? And you could be out of compliance in your transition. So the core issue I'm bringing to you today is, 1, approaches are examples to the points of focus, but please keep in mind that one approach may apply to multiple points of focus, and we'll learn a best practice transition aid for you today that you can apply tomorrow in your transition plan on how to know which approach, based on volume 3 and 4 of COSO's guidance for its new framework, how to do that and how to do it very effectively and quickly. The one thing I really want to hone in on in this refreshed framework that I find over and over again when we do our control compliance analysis, we're finding that A lot of folks are misunderstanding the need to evaluate their outside service providers and business partners for their adherence to the standards of conduct. And I'm highlighting it on purpose because it's a very common control failure for a lot of people. And if you're transitioning to the new framework, I can assure you both your external auditors and those that are evaluating this transition plan are probably going to hone in on it, okay? It goes to your point of focus of item number 3, okay? So item number 3 for every volume, volume 3 and 4 of the guidance materials, all are calling out that you have to also include people who you've outsourced some of your controls, like your payroll provider. Not to mention, you'll see that there's a process to report. That process of reporting deviations, meaning somebody deviated from the standards of conduct, whether it's your ethics policy or your code of ethics, it doesn't matter. You have to have a documented process of how things get reported and how you're going to act upon those items timely when they do get reported, and that does include your outside service providers. So you can't exclude them from this process. So visually, how do we understand principles and points of focus? The best way I've described it is to show somebody this bar stool. And imagine you're going to your favorite pub or hangout and there's this bar stool. Imagine the seat, okay, is the principal, all right? So in this case, principal 1 is the seat, and there are 4 legs to this stool. The question you have to ask yourself when you do transition is if you were missing a few legs, if this point of focus leg was gone and this point of focus leg was gone, would you feel comfortable sitting on that bar stool seat that you won't fall? That's the analysis. This is the visual analysis you're going to go through in the transition to the new framework. So even though COSO says you don't have to check the box and identify all 80-some odd points of focus, the real question that you have to ask yourself is, okay, if I say no to this point of focus, how many other legs to this bar stool for this principle am I willing to really feel confident that I can sit on this bar stool without falling? So it's a pretty good analogy for those of you who are considering, checking the box and not really considering the aggregate effect of the principles and the points of focus and how they relate. And our transition template that we're offering you today covers this core item of identifying that seat and then really analyzing the legs to that seat. So I'm going to move on to the next item here. So we're having some minor technical difficulties here getting to the next slide. All right, so we're going to offer a quick case study just on Principle 1. We're going to look at the entire effectiveness of Principle 1. And it's straight from COSO's guidance on how to transition in Volume 3. Principle 1 says, the organization demonstrates, a commitment to integrity and ethical values, right? You're demonstrating. That's just the principles, okay? Now, again, this case study is coming straight from COSO itself in its Volume 3, and we'll get to it. And it's going to cover findings. Imagine you're the chief audit executive and you found some issues or items that need to be addressed as you're transitioning to the new framework. Okay, so I apologize for having a little bit of technical glitches and moving forward quickly. So here is the quick background. You have a private company. It's a retail furniture company. It's family owned, and it's got $200 million in revenue, and the sales are exclusively in Western United States. Now you're going to evaluate just principle one. Remember dealing with integrity, ethical values. You're demonstrating this. So you're about to transition to the new framework, and you find out there's a few issues going on in this private retail furniture company. The first thing you find out is there's really no formal training program to make employees aware of the importance to adhere to the standard of conduct. So really, right from the get-go, number one, it tells you this company has a standard of conduct. They have a policy. But there's no training to make anybody aware of the importance of this policy. The second finding is there's no process to evaluate the employees against the published integrity and ethics policy. Interesting. Point 3 is processes to identify and address deviations are ad hoc, right? It's just kind of going with the flow in terms of the process of identifying and addressing deviations. So I wanted to open up a quick polling question to you all. Given the facts that I just stated, how bad are these 3 findings for this company? How severe are they? Is this a control deficiency, which is a low priority for this private company, $200 million, they only have sales in the U.S.? Is this a significant deficiency, meaning it's a moderate priority, or is this a major deficiency and they do not meet principle 1? In other words, this company cannot say they abide by principle 1 and they have a major deficiency on their hands. So, again, I'm going to open this up for just 1 minute and close it out. So what do you think about this case? This is straight from Volume 3, and for those of you who have not purchased your COSO materials, Volume 3 is the analysis of how effective your internal controls are based on COSO's various case studies in Volume 3. So I offer this up because it's the very first principle. It's easy to digest, and a lot of people who we've shared this case study with, it resonates with them very well. So again, we're opening it up for just another 10 more seconds. We'll close it out for you in just a minute. So please answer, is this a control deficiency, B, significant deficiency, or C, major deficiency? They're not going to pass the principle. Okay, so most of you thought, 30 some odd percent thought that it was B, a significant deficiency, and 28% thought it was a major deficiency, and then some of you thought, 14% thought it was a control deficiency. The correct answer for this is it's a major deficiency. So a third of you got it right. The remainder of you did not. The correct answer, again, was it's a major deficiency. Let's see what that visually looks like. We have a picture here to visualize the findings. So remember, there were 4 points of focus to Principle 1. So the company, this private company, had a standard of conduct, okay? So this leg to that bar stool, going back to my bar stool analogy, they had it. They had a policy there. But to evaluate adherence, you can see already the leg, it's on shaky ground. They can't really say they have that leg to that bar stool. And then addresses deviation, as you recall, there was a finding that it was ad hoc. So that leg is also on shaky ground and probably doesn't exist. So how can you say you really set the tone for the point of focus on the first one, where you're walking the walk, talking the talk, and you're doing the right thing because it's always the best thing to do the right thing all the time? So as you can see, if you had one leg to this bar stool, would you feel confident in sitting in that seat and it not falling apart on you? So arguably, you would say probably not. Now you can see how this is a major deficiency visually by looking at each point of focus in my bar stool analogy with the legs. So how are you going to transition if you're dealing with all these legs and different bar stools, etc.? Well, here at Aviva Spectrum, and also to give back to our COSO implementation group community, we created a very unique and very practical transition template. And I already offered earlier in the webinar the web address, avivaspectrum.com/blog. You'll see the COSO template there, and you'll have to download that. So the very first thing is it's a 2-tab Excel spreadsheet. The first item is to deal with the points of focus only. Since COSO is saying that not all points of focus are relevant to each company, well, okay, let's start there. So the very first tab to our template covers, is this in scope for the organization or not? And if you say yes or no, what's your evaluation comment? How are you reaching that conclusion to make that determination? So that's the first tab. That's step one. Is this point of focus relevant to the organization? Once you've said yes, meaning you put a Y, the letter Y, in a very specific formula that we created in this template, what's going to happen is this will pre-populate. There's a formula in each of these cells to say, what did you agree to in the very first tab if you said the point of focus was in scope, yes or no? If you put Y for yes, the wording in scope will show up. Now, remember the legs. These are all your legs here, 1 through 4 on the far left. You have 4 legs to principle 1. Well, what are my approaches? What are my options to evaluate? Well, COSO, in its guidance materials, offered 4. We just, instead of creating a numeric sequence, we did something different. We said, look, we'll just give them a letter. Approaches will have letters, A through D, and then we've cross-referenced them to the legs, because not each approach ties back one-to-one to each item here. So let's cover how you would transition moving forward into this template. So again, some of you are asking about where the location is. It's on our blog, avivaspectrum.com/blog, and you'll see it's called the COSO template. You can find it there. So going back to the formula, you'll see that if you in the first tab were to say yes, then it's going to say the item is in scope. If you put a no, it's going to say, or anything else, if you forget or you left it blank, when you get to that second tab, it'll say out of scope. So already this Excel-driven formula will give you a heads up of items that you're going to have to consider, or you may have forgotten to include them in your initial point of focus analysis. So the reference to your approach, like I stated earlier, it's very important to pick the best of breed. So you can see that this one here deals with a point of focus number 2, and this one deals with 1 and 2. So if I were to pick this approach, I'm doing more basically with less, because I've already cross-referenced that item. So our template, we think, is the most practical template because we've already sorted through hundreds of pages. The total set of COSO pages, by the way, from all the materials, there are 501 pages for all 2013 COSO materials. We've sorted them out for you, and we've highlighted for you how to cross-reference to the key legs to that principle for you. And you just have to make an educated guess whether or not that approach suits your needs. Is this something that's being used? Yes or no? So once you get to that point, you now have a better roadmap to offer to your audit committee members, your C-level executive management, whether or not you have used that approach, yes or no. And if you say no, the great thing about your analysis is if I put no here, it's okay because I've got my yes here, and it just so happens that this particular approach covers more than one leg to to my bar stool. So right away, I'm already shaving off certain key controls that I might not need because I've already mapped out the COSO transition to the most important approaches that meet a broader set of specific legs to my bar stool. Okay, so we're going to move on. If you can please hold your questions towards the end, I'd be happy to get to them. After you've done this analysis of, yes, this is a point of focus, these are the approaches I'm going to be using, you now need to look at last year's results. Did you really pass based on the approaches listed here, or did you really fail? So going back to our private company, we would probably put fail on B, C, and D because, remember, they only had a policy in play. They really couldn't lead by example. They had no evidence of that. So regardless if you're a private company with only $200 million in revenue, you're going to have to look at your prior year internal control testing and look at the conclusions by principle if this was a control deficiency, a significant deficiency, or a material weakness. COSO does not call out material weakness in word-for-word letter form. It calls it a major deficiency. There's only one example where they actually call it a material weakness because it was dealing with a public company. But I don't want you to get confused on the language because the meaning is essentially the same when you're dealing with failures. So there's 3 levels of failures. I wanted to ask a very important question that is impacting all organizations because we are living in a global environment. The last study I saw was that, especially here in the United States, 95% of the world's population is outside of the United States. So we are living in a global economy. My question to you, because of this global economy, is we're dealing with more and more multi-locations where we're doing business. I wanted to find out from you all if you have in scope multi-locations for control testing. This is you having to do internal control work for multiple locations. So we're going to keep it open for just a quick moment, probably about 30 seconds. Okay, again, this is dealing with internal control testing in multi-locations. All right, we're going to close the poll now. So over 50% of you have in-scope multi-locations, and a little less than 20% do not have multi-location issues. This is going to resonate with the vast majority of you, which is also included in the template is the multi-location issue. In other words, when you're dealing with the transition template that we've offered, you're going to have to ask yourself, is this a multi-location issue? We have found in practice that there's more and more companies that have a lot of transition issues with multi-locations. And we put it in the template. If you are a single office operation, you do not need to fill this out. This does not apply. But if you do, you must fill this multi-location issue, yes or no. The way you're answering it is this an item I have to evaluate at that location? And should I, for the transition to the new framework, actually consider that location, whoever's heading up the operations, to include them in the COSO transition committee? Because that's what's happening now in practice is people are setting up COSO transition committees and including those multi-locations. Now I want to talk about options. Let's say you are not as sophisticated in terms of understanding some of these approaches, right? Because we only abbreviated these approaches. We did not put in a ton of examples underneath each approach to say, establishing standards of conduct. Here's an example of that. what we did is we offered you one of the best cheat sheets in the world right now for the COSO transition, which is in Volume 4, when you have to purchase the COSO materials anyways. In Volume 4, they have a lot of examples. We put the page number of where you're going to find the examples to each of these approaches. So if you decide, yes, you're going to do it, and you want to find out what's best of breed or what COSO says is a great example, we've just shaved off at least several hours of you researching what page number and what examples and where it's located right there for you by looking at Volume 4. Now I wanted to visualize for you your COSO transition in terms of principles-based approach and the points of focus. So you'll see here is the principle at the very top. So remember, that's your bar stool seat, right? And you've got, for principle 1, different points of focus. You have 4 legs to that bar stool, and they're in blue. Now remember, COSO says for each of these legs, they're going to give you practical approaches that meet these legs. But each approach, like this one, approach A, meets 2 legs of the bar stool. Approach B might deal with 1 leg, whereas approach C deals with, let's say, 2 legs of the bar stool. Okay? So as you're going through our transition template, you're going to ask yourself, okay, well, what examples are offered up in Volume 4 in case you wanted to double check if you're not under or overkilling your transition to the new framework. You can now look at the page numbers because we reflected that in our template by page number, and you're going to look at the key controls by each example. So we listed them out here. So imagine you're transitioning to the new framework. You decide you're going to use approach A, and approach A has a couple examples on page 17 and 18. Okay? Each example is going to have different key controls that you're going to evaluate. So it would behoove you, right, if you took a look at not only the examples, but ask yourself, how many key controls is it going to take if I wanted to do example 1 for this approach A that meets 2 of my legs here? Well, this one has 3 key controls. This one has 4. I probably don't want to really analyze this when I can actually just do what's required and leverage 3 key controls here that I'll be testing for approach A. Approach C, the same thing. There were 2 examples, but example 2 offers up 2 key controls that you'll be evaluating. Example 1 may have 4 key controls. You probably don't want to pick that. So this is just a practical visual aid of how to analyze the relationship between those legs to the approaches, and then when you get to the pages in Volume 4, how to evaluate those examples, because you will have to go through how many key controls for each example, because ultimately it does come down to testing. So I mentioned to you earlier that we offer a lot of free guidance materials. This is offered for free by COSO itself. Okay? I am notorious for allowing everybody just to gain access to these slides. You'll find them on slideshare.net. The reason why I offer my PowerPoint slides is I love to hyperlink source materials to source websites. So this COSO transition guidance right here goes to source, I'll put here materials, hyperlinked to COSO site for free download. So you need to go to, I'll tell you, slideshare.net and look up Aviva Spectrum, and you'll find our slides for this transition and other slides. And again, my slides are notoriously hyperlinked. Every time you see a picture, it'll hyperlink straight to the source material where I got it from. That PDF that I just shared with you, that screenshot, it's a lot of text. It's good reading, but I wanted to come up with a webinar for you today that dealt with actionable items that you can do today or tomorrow in your office. Step one of COSO's guidance, and something that we recommend as well, is start the awareness and education process. That's step one. But the action item is, imagine you have an Excel spreadsheet, Word document, it doesn't matter, but you have a plan of who needs to read about the new framework, just so everybody gets their heads around what is it going to take to actually transition to the new framework. So I came up with a quick example. If I were to read the COSO transition guidance material, what would I need to create just to kind of take those words and put it down to an action plan, okay? So step one, they're calling out awareness and education, and you'll see that I just created a very simple, easy to read grid here where I would call out the group, the document they would need to read, the delivery date, and then what's the next step. So in this case, in step one, awareness and education, I've got the board needs to do some level of reading, and they'll read the executive summary, which is only 10 pages long. The SOX director, chief audit executive, or audit manager, they're going to need to read all 4 materials. They will more than likely need to read the COSO cloud-based guidance. They may need to read the COSO monitoring guidance that I already called out earlier that was issued in 2008. Now the question is due dates, right? So the board should have finished their reading by the first quarterly meeting, especially if you're transitioning this year. The SOX director has a tighter deadline. He's got a lot of reading. I already mentioned to you earlier, it's 501 pages from soup to nuts. From executive summary all the way down to volume 4, you're looking at 501 pages. When we did an analysis at a different organization, we showed them statistics of the Bible, and the New Testament has a little over 200 pages. So when you're asking someone to read this awareness and education, you're actually asking them, if you're truly asking them to read all volumes, you're asking them to read the Bible, New Testament, twice. That's kind of the analogy that I would put out. So if you haven't started this awareness and education grid, that should be done tomorrow. Somebody's got to own up to reading and getting a clear understanding of what needs to be done to transition, and they need to do it tomorrow. The next step is a preliminary impact analysis. This is to say, remember those control failures in our template? COSO is saying, well, just take an area like entity level controls, which we have here, and do an impact assessment on just those top-down controls and find out from your prior analysis, what items are covered in terms of key controls. Then your impact is, well, what's new in 2013 that I really didn't assess that well? Forgive me. So here, this Excel file is saying, I have 45 items to cover for my entity level control assessment. I know that there's 5 principles and 17 points of focus. And there are 25 unique examples in the approaches. I'm going to give myself 2 weeks lead time to evaluate those examples, and I'm going to have a due date of March 1st. I have to come up with an inventory listing of items or issues I need to consider a week later. My advice to you is that these approaches and unique examples, they each have about 2 to 3 controls per approach. So you're really multiplying 25 by 2 or 3, so you've got about 20, so you're probably looking at anywhere between 50 to 75 controls that you may need to assess in your transition plan. So really the preliminary impact assessment isn't so much are you passing and failing, it's actually what am I missing, and then what approaches do I need to, what's the totality of all the approaches and examples I need to evaluate. So this is just a high-level impact assessment. Step 3 is getting your board and external auditors in alignment for each business unit how things are going to transition. I put the number 6 months right next to these assessments. So you're going to deal with corporate, office, the financial and IT assessments, your division, remember the multi-location, so I know over half of you have multi-location issues. And you might need to look at an operational unit, which is a subset of your division, also in the finance and IT area. But overall, I would argue that your lead time is definitely about 6 months if you had to transition. Because let's not forget, you have to read the materials, you probably are going to do your impact assessment, and you're going to find out what kind of examples really apply to your organization that COSO offers up in volume 3 and 4. So this transition analysis that we created for a different company, I wanted to share this with you because this might be something very helpful for some of you. You'll see that we've allocated to certain subsidiaries here, okay? We've broke out each division. So we have Inglewood, Denver, Dallas, and you'll see that for the audit of controls, I'll point this out here, Inglewood was fully in scope, Denver was in scope, but Texas was partial, okay? So we were dealing with Principle 1, looking at the points of focus, and imagine we said, yes, this is a multi-location issue. Now the question is, what's the depth of that issue? How deep is this for each of these locations? And corporate office is in Los Angeles. So for an entity level type of principle like Principle 1, obviously it's going to impact corporate office. But the question is, setting the tone, board and management, if you're dealing with a partial scope item like this location in Dallas, Texas, how much are you going to be doing in terms of setting the tone? It may be corporate office, it may be limited, you have to make that determination. So when the board asks you how is it going to impact locations, this is just one example we're offering you to add to the current template on how you would want to inform the board of, fully in scope, partially in scope. Is this going to be impacting the transition for potential testing, or limited impact, or no impact given the size, complexity, and past performance? So there's different legends out there. We found that just keeping it simple makes the best sense for a lot of people. So this is one more in-depth way of looking at the transition by location. Now, after you summarized the impact, you got to get down to the key controls. Because ultimately, when you transition, you're going to have to test those controls. Here's one way in your transition to evaluate on a per control basis how to transition properly. So here we have the same principle. In this case, we're dealing with that Inglewood division. It's fully in scope. You can see that right here. And you're asking yourself, are we passing or failing? You'll see the control number is listed here. So we're literally going control by control, seeing this is payroll 1, control payroll 6, payroll 6 control. You'll see that these were the samples collected last year. Okay, this is the quantity or the volume of samples, the work that you're going to need to do. And then the question is, did you pass or fail last year? In this case, this location, Inglewood, failed, and it resulted in a control deficiency because it just wasn't being performed. There was no evidence of the performance evaluation being done. And guess what? It links, right? It links to 2 of your legs of your bar stool, okay? So if the board or C-level wanted to know warning signs by location, this is probably one of the more I wouldn't call it sophisticated, just more practical ways of showing them, hey, you know what? Inglewood needs to get their act together, okay? Because they're fully in scope, they're failing when it comes to the payroll control number 6 on the performance evaluation because it's just not being done. So this is a great way to get multi-locations in order to understand not only their role, but also the impact. I wanted to offer up a very important polling question that a lot of you are getting impacted today, and that's the new PCOB audit alert number 11 that was issued in October 2013. And this audit alert is basically asking both the external auditors and pushing on companies to do a better job of auditing internal controls. So I'm going to open the poll. Are you adopting the new PCOB control standards? So please, if you say yes, select A. If you say no, click on item B. If you really do not know if you're applying those standards or those standards apply to you, just simply click C. You don't know. All right. Again, are you adopting the new PCOB internal control standards? A is yes, B is no, C is you don't know. All right, we're going to close out the polling question. So it's not a high percentage, but we've got 38% saying yes, 11% saying no, and then 28% of you saying that you don't know. So what I can tell you is this is going to be the new gold standard, not just for public companies, but for private companies as well. Right here we have a picture of the staff audit alert number 11 issued by the PCOB, and it was issued in October 24th of 2013. And the major items I wanted to cover with you is it's causing what we call audit layering, and also a higher, more in-depth description of your estimates and use of judgment, and also testing the system reports that support your internal controls and the judgment you use for those reports. And let me give you an example of the impact. The first is, think about your review controls that we used to write. For those of you who have implemented the new PCOB internal control standards, this is going to resonate with you perfectly. For those of you who will, which most of you will in the very near future, this is what the old management review control language would look like. It would state something like this. Quarterly controller reviews the AR allowance for adequacy and reasonableness of reserve amounts by initialing and dating the AR reserve analysis, right? So we would assume the controller's competent, they know what they're doing, they look at the reserve, and then they sign off. So what would we do? We would look at the controller's initial, match the totals, maybe do summary performance, but essentially the signature was good and we were done. According to the new PCOB standards, that's no longer valid. We have to actually document management's thought process in the use of judgment. We now have to say, for example, how is he reviewing the balances? Well, in the updated or the PCOB version of how that control should be stated, it would say significant customers with outstanding balances greater than 10K and 5% of the AR balance. In other words, the controller is looking at significant customers. He's not wasting his time on tiny little customers. Well, how do you define that? So he is looking at balances greater than 10K and 5% of the total AR balance. Then anybody underneath that dollar threshold, he's looking at the customer type, like geographical location, the types of orders they're placing, and then if there's an adjustment that's needed, right, he's calling upon his AR manager to help out. So it's really not just the controller that has the final say on the reserve, it's the AR manager. So the before and after, in terms of testing, we call it audit layering. We're now looking at the initials, we're looking at the reports, and we're validating those reports. We're looking at emails and interviews with that AR, and just doing initial testing, like what we've done in the past, is no longer valid. Step 4 in terms of your transition is your planning documentation. So I would highly encourage you to consider aligning to the new PCAOB internal control standards. It's something that we at Aviva, with our control compliance analysis, already do for our clients. But it's something to consider because I know for a fact that the PCAOB is aligning itself with its counterpart in the international communities to come up with what they call is the audit quality model, or some of them are calling it the audit quality framework. And essentially, it's how do you know you're doing a quality audit, and to come up with a framework like we did for controls, like the COSO framework. PCAOB is already working with international counterparts to come up with that framework. So regardless if you're a nonprofit, a government, private company, there will be a framework on how to do a quality audit. So I know it's in the pipeline and will affect all organizations regardless if you're a public company or not. So I wanted to move into how we view the COSO transition, and I'll cover a subject matter expert on this particular transition as well. Our control compliance analysis looks to the top transition failures that we know are very common in most organizations. So we have backup case studies and training sessions. So when we go through this control compliance analysis with our clients, we already cover that in our transition template. Second, we already know the audit evidence required to make it effective. Going back to that first case study on those findings, you saw that I think a third of you got it wrong. The remainder of you got it right, but what I can tell you on a per principal basis, it's not that easy to transition. Second, when we do our transition analysis, it's very priority driven by principles. In addition, we've aligned our control compliance analysis based on the PCAOB standards, the IIA standards, and the latest and greatest from the Securities Exchange Commission on internal controls as well. Our control compliance analysis, in short, we do a quick intake. It's anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half long. We do some initial analysis based on the sample set of data that you provide us and do some benchmarking. And then we come up with a CCA report, which is basically your cheat sheet, your COSO transition cheat sheet of the top priority items you need to address to transition to the new framework. Now, I really am honing in on this benchmarking of your external auditor reliance because this is a big hot topic. Every time we've done the control compliance analysis, it typically results in tens of thousands of dollars of savings. And I wanted to ask you, are you benchmarking your external auditor reliance? And what that means, I'm going to open up the poll, is your auditor relying upon your own internal audit work papers? There are several audit standards, both international and domestic here in the U.S., that allow the auditor to rely on your work paper. But when I say benchmarking, are you really knowing the percentage that they're using in terms of your audit work papers? Do you actually have a number that you can clearly define to the audit committee or executive management and say, I know for a fact our external auditors are using X percent of our work papers? So the answer is either A, yes, you are benchmarking your external auditor's reliance. You know that percentage that they're relying upon in terms of your work papers. B, no, it doesn't apply. And then B is no and C doesn't apply to me. So again, A is yes, B is no, and C doesn't apply to me. We're going to only open this up for 2 more seconds, and we'll close it out. Okay. All right, so So 37% of you said that, yes, you are benchmarking, which I want to say kudos to you. B, which was no, that's 29%, and C is it doesn't apply to you. For those of you who said C doesn't apply to me, I would challenge you, because if you are getting an external audit opinion, it does actually apply to you, right? All audits require that the auditor gain an understanding of internal controls. So the fact is that they can, it's just a matter of what should they be leveraging. And here are some results of an objective study that we found. This was done by Protivity. When we do our control compliance analysis, we benchmark not only to what the company is currently doing, but also its peers. You'll see, this is just one question, by the way, that we benchmark, but we benchmark on several other metrics. But this is for low-risk processes. What percentage of work, right, is your auditor relying upon on a low-risk process? You'll see that the people that had an internal audit function, they got up to 29% right up here. What's interesting is in 2002, they had actually 33%. So there's actually in the marketplace a downward trend. And you'll see that there was a 50 to 75%, again, also downward trend. It was 12% of them had that reliance, but it's down from 18% a year ago. So we know, based on our control compliance analysis, that when we get to 75 or 50%, the average savings when we bump it up by 5 to 10% is anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 of cost savings. And this is assuming you're using a larger firm and they're doing less to get their work product done and charging you less to get that work product done. So that's been our past experience with companies that have performed the control compliance analysis and offered up samples to us. So if you haven't really benchmarked, which we had a pretty decent percentage of you not benchmarking, ask yourself, is it worth $10,000 or $20,000 of savings for your organization? That's really the true question you need to be asking. I wanted to share with you, as we're wrapping up, we're going to get to the Q&A session, Norman Mark's video. He talks about the COSO transition and adding value. He has a new book that he issued out last year, and it deals with the COSO framework. In our slides, we have both the hyperlink to Norman Mark's video on our YouTube channels. You can go to YouTube and look up Aviva Spectrum. You'll find this video. And he specifically calls out how both the COSO transition is not only a kind of a monotonous exercise, but it's also a great opportunity. But it's only an opportunity for those of you who really want to add value, like the value of getting your auditors to rely upon more of your work papers. So later on, excuse me, when you download these slides, you'll gain access to this hyperlink to the video to hear him discuss how he thinks the transition should happen to the COSO framework. And also there's a hyperlink to his book on Amazon if you're interested in aligning to the COSO framework and using best practices based on Norman Marks. He's considered the #1 influential internal auditor by the CEO of the IIA, Richard Chambers. I also interviewed Norman on our Blog Talk Radio show. We have other subject matter experts that we interview on Blog Talk Radio. We have several IT audit experts. We've had some big data auditing experts and some risk assessment best practice aids that we're offering up. So please follow us on Blog Talk Radio. You'll find us, the channel is considered, it's compliance expert. And we're about to wrap up to the Q&A session. And I know a lot of you got a lot of value from this webinar. What I don't want you to do is download the template that we have on our blog, wait about 2 weeks, think about the transition, wait about another 2 weeks, and then totally forget about what we just discussed. I really, truly want this to be an actionable webinar that for some of you who are live with me now can get your own proprietary control compliance analysis that is basically your COSO transition health check for 10 of you. I do not have unlimited time, and my admin is available today to get your transition next steps going. So if you're, I would highly recommend you email us. The email is info@avivaspectrum.com to reserve your spot with me personally to come up with your own control compliance analysis report card. And if you haven't done so already, please become a COSO implementation member. Please download the transition templates and the slides. I already have slideshare.net, and get your control compliance analysis done with me personally. The email to get that reservation is info@avivaspectrum.com. I want you to put in the subject header CCA reservation. Now, we are volunteering our time to the COSO implementation group. I would ask a professional courtesy for those of you who got a lot of value from this free webinar to please write a recommendation of our compliance and internal audit training in our services page in LinkedIn. My contact information is here, and I'm going to open it up. The best way to reach me is on LinkedIn.